was the principal of the architectural firm of Stubbins Associates in Cambridge, Mass. Before embarking on a career as a development officer with Las Vegas Sands and MGM Resorts International, Las Vegas, Macau, Singapore, and the Arab Emirates. He has made more than 100 trips across 6 continents, 3 oceans, 50 countries, hundreds of cities, and countless parks and preserves so far. I present Jim.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for coming. I don't know if any of you were present. I gave an earlier version of this presentation about a year ago, so I hope it's not too repetitive for you guys. This first slide is a painting by the artist Grace Hardigan. It was done in 1970, and it's entitled St. George and the Dragon. It's an abstract expressionist work, and it's on display at the MGM National Harbor in Maryland in a collection which I was privileged to help curate. As you can see, it balances brilliant color planes with symbolic imagery relevant to the legend of St. George. So you can see the knife up at the top, and you can see several beast-like rear ends with long tails and shapes reminiscent of flames and swords. Hardigan said that dragons delivered instant metaphors. After all, who has seen a dragon? Well, if you think about it, nobody's ever seen a dragon, because it's a mythical creature. To be sure, there are likenesses of dragons throughout human history. This grave near Beyer in Hunan Province, China, has a dragon formed of shells interred next to the body, with what looks like a tiger on the opposite side, so you can see the dragon on the left. This is one of the oldest known images of dragons. It's from 6000 BC. In Chinese mythology, the dragon was often depicted holding a globe representing the earth, with its triple-clawed foot. These are pictures from my dragon collection. The dragon was believed to be descended from heaven, filled with goodwill. In fact, it was thought that dragons helped govern the universe. Though fierce in appearance, the dragon was believed to be a guardian of the world. In this particular interpretation, the dragon holds the orb in his mouth. Westernized interpretations of the dragon have demonized it by endowing it with powers like flight and the ability to breathe flames. This is a cell from the 2002 movie Reign of Fire, which if you haven't seen, I would recommend. Matthew McConaughey stars in it. Or more familiarly, Valerian the Black Dread from the recent TV series Game of Thrones. Which brings us back full circle to the fable of St. George and the Dragon, interpreted here in a woodcut by Albrecht Dürer from 1501. So, my question is, what does an arrangement of shells over 8,000 years old have in common with a woodcut from 1501, an abstract painting from 1970, and an animation from a TV series in the early 21st century? The obvious answer is, they are all representations of dragons. The problem is that we've already established that dragons are mythical creatures. They don't exist, or do they? It isn't an actual dragon that these representations stand for. It's the idea of a dragon. Now, if an idea can persist solely in the human imagination over a span of 80 centuries, I think it's fair to say that an idea is a pretty powerful thing. I think travel has a lot to do with ideas. Now I'd like to paraphrase for you a short essay by the late American author Paul Auster. At first it might not seem to have any more to do with our subject today than dragons, but bear with me. It's called Why Write, and it was published in late 1995 in the New Yorker magazine. In the essay, Auster tells 5 short stories. I'll relate one of them. And I have taken the liberty to generate some meta-AI images to help you visualize this story. All the other photographs are mine, but these come from AI. It concerns Oster's family staying for the summer in a rented farmhouse on a remote Vermont mountainside. A neighbor dropped by one afternoon with her children. They quickly befriended Oster's own children before they all ran off to play upstairs in the back of the house. As Oster and his wife sat conversing with a friend, they heard a crash from where the children were playing. Oster realized that the children had knocked over a vase that was sitting on a bench beside the staircase railing. He volunteered to clean up the mess and stepped into the rear hall to do so. The staircase in the hall was very narrow. At the bottom was a window sitting a few feet above the landing. Oster was about half finished with the cleanup job when his daughter rushed out from her room onto the second floor landing above. Suddenly, the toe of her sneaker caught on the landing, and just like that, without any cry or warning, she was sailing through the air. The stumble had literally launched her into space. And from the trajectory of her flight, Oster could see that she was heading straight for the window. It was a transitional moment. A moment when he needed to do something but was completely incapable of doing anything. What could he do? He didn't know what to do. He was on the wrong side of the banister when he saw her trip. By the time she was midway between the landing and the window, he noticed he was standing on the bottom step of the staircase. He didn't know how he got there. It didn't really matter. Somehow he was there. And the moment he got there, he opened his arms and he caught her. Oster used this anecdote to illustrate his answer to the question, why write? You write because you have a story to tell. And as I will show you later, this has a direct relationship to the question, why travel? But first, let's consider the moment that Oster described, the importance of the moment that Oster described, that transitional moment. In that confused moment, it was an instant when Oster could have done something or done nothing at all. All of us have been in situations when we are faced with a choice. Our very language embodies its importance to us. Imagine you were on a trip, sitting in a train in a station. The train is still, as is another train on the track right next to you, visible through your window. Suddenly, there is just the slightest sensation of movement. At first, you aren't quite sure if it's your train moving forward or the train next to you moving in the opposite direction. For a moment, you are confused and uncomfortable, in limbo about the situation. In that moment, you grasp for what you can know. Did you feel a jerk, or did you sense a vibration? Something quite remarkable happens in that moment. We can see that when we look at rituals and rites of passage. We have, say, during a fraternity or sorority activation ritual, the so-called initiation period, which is meant to move the participant from the world she knows into a world that she doesn't, to prepare her for the transition into a new state of being. Likewise, the Jewish traditions of bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah and the Christian rites of communion or confirmation detach us from one stage of life before admitting us to another, exposing us to a liminal state as we undergo the transition. Similarly, we've also experienced actual physical border crossings where liminal space occurs as we move out of the domain of one country and into the domain of another. These liminal spaces are purposely ambiguous, intentionally uncomfortable, so that we are compelled to move through them and into another realm as opposed to staying with them. That threshold moment on the train is a liminal experience. And I want to suggest that travel is full of such experiences. Times when you can't quite understand what you're experiencing until suddenly you do. So, back to our train. All at once, the moment is over. Your seat rocks where there's a glint or a reflection. One train moves, and you're on your way. Why do we choose to travel? Why put up with the jet lag, the sleepless nights, the strange food, the unusual weather, cookie-cutter hotel rooms, expensive tourist traps, and incomprehensible foreign languages? This case against travel is made in another more recent article from the New Yorker in which the author essentially argues that as a visitor one is constantly doing stupid touristy things that one would never do at home, like taking a dawn walk across the desert or visiting a falconry museum, and thus exposing oneself to a certain disappointment of expectation build up while one was imagining what a wonderful time one would have while traveling. In other words, the frantic passage through the Sistine Chapel in the company of 200 other gawking, sweating tourists is not the transcendent experience you envision when looking at the bookplate reproductions of Michelangelo's frescoes. But people do it anyway, perhaps as a source for joy. Maybe they just want some time off, to play golf at Pebble Beach, or take a walk along the Aegean Sea in Greece, or just enjoy the wildlife in Miami Beach. Others see it as a form of release, taking an opportunity for shopping on the Ginza, at the Souk in Muscat, Oman, or in the Grand Bazaar of Istanbul. Some want to relax at a fancy restaurant like the Taj Palace in New Delhi and just enjoy a great meal. Or maybe try something completely different for dinner. Perhaps it's adventure that lures people away from home. The chance to hike along the edge of a precipice on the Bright Angel Trail in Grand Canyon, or jump off a waterfall into Deer Creek. I believe that all this kind of activity, however entertaining, conflates the distinction between the tourist and the traveler. The tourist goes to places out of a sense of desire. To have toured a place gets branded as an achievement. See interesting places, have interesting experiences, become an interesting person. Does it really work that way? I don't think so. A traveler goes places out of a sense of destiny, because she must. For the same reason Paul Auster appeared at the bottom of that stair. There's no choice about it. That's the only reason one would brave the indignities of leisure travel, because it's a compulsion. The Germans have a word for it, and it hints at a yearning, something inside us. What could be so powerful that it can drive us to do such a thing, to embody the wanderlust? Human beings crave order. It's why we have a natural tendency to classify things and why we look for patterns, whether visual, acoustical, or textual, in everything we encounter. It's why we use metaphors, so we can make a thing we don't understand like another thing we do understand. When we come across an apparently random or chaotic event or object, we try to make sense of it, to relate it to something with which we are familiar. If you look at this image long enough, you'll see the railings, and eventually you might realize they are fire escapes. And after some thought, you might realize the image is actually a reflection of building facades in the highly polished hood and windshield of an automobile. When this twisted pile of junk appears before you on the trail in the middle of the woods, it is first chaotic. But then you notice the tire and the steering wheel and maybe something that looks like an engine block. And, oh, isn't that a seat over there? You struggle to find order. You make up a story knitting everything together, and in so doing, you come to an understanding that enlarges your comprehension of things. Travel can provide the medium for this in a very multidimensional way. We all have a concept of the color blue, built up from a lifetime of encountering blue things. There's a kind of mental picture of blue that everyone possesses. Probably a little different for each one of us, but similar enough that we can understand what someone means when they say blue. I had such a mental picture of blue when I embarked on my third trip to Alaska in 2021. In Tracy Arm, off the Inland Passage in southeast Alaska, I encountered a shade of blue I had never yet seen. It was a bottomless, thick, glacial blue, which, when seen in the bracing cold and vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, was unforgettable. Not only did it expand my understanding of the color blue, it came with such depth and richness of sensation that I will never forget it. Such is the possibility of travel. The realization of order can come about in a very, very different way. At a general level, a sort of 10,000-foot view, the Grand Canyon is a very orderly place. A river has cut a 250-mile swath through the earth as a result of billions of years of erosion and uplift. When we look at the vista of the canyon, we can see very clearly the hierarchies of layered rock strata and drainage channels that eventually culminate in their lowest level in a major artery, the Colorado River. Everything eventually sweeps into a giant collection basin, once the Pacific Ocean, but now a reservoir called Lake Mead. But if we descend into the canyon, say on foot or by mule, we lose this overview, and the canyon becomes quite incomprehensible. We lose our bearings because we no longer can sense the overall order. There are trails, but we can't see where they lead. Sometimes, like when the path traverses bare rock, we can't even see the trail ahead of us. When the trail disappears, it's very disconcerting, I can tell you. You find yourself in a rock-strewn landscape with no idea about which way to proceed. Fortunately, because human beings crave order, there has evolved a means for marking the trail. Simple trail cairns, organized little piles of stones or rocks, provide order within the chaos and show us which way to go. I think it is this fundamental need for order, the need to assimilate what we see and don't understand into what we have seen and do, that makes travel, the experiencing of new and unfamiliar situations, and the integration of them into our understanding of things, such an important part of life. That experience can take many forms. We've all seen the beautiful fall colors, particular to the northeastern United States. But when you see them from above, you can truly see nature's grand order unfold at a scale not available from our normal viewpoint. Everyone knows the canyon-like feeling of being in New York at street level. But seeing New York from above can give you a new understanding of its organization and its order. This is the Taj Mahal, long thought to be one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. We can think of it as a perfectly proportioned building constructed of white marble. What we don't see until we get nearby is that it is a white marble building inlaid with literally thousands of flowered mosaic and carved tiles, which give the whole composition an up-close scale that can't be appreciated from afar. I had to travel to India to understand this. In fact, for me, India has provided a new understanding of the idea of many things, like fire escapes, pet stores, celestial observatories, domesticated animals, delivery vans, street food in all its forms, bathing, the plight of the homeless, and funerals. Each one of these experiences in India brought me up against a different form of an idea that was already clear in my head. And each time that happened, I paused, recalibrated, and let the idea expand intellectually. Such are the opportunities of travel. But after all, I'm an architect. And for architects, it always comes back to the buildings. They come in various flavors. Something overwhelmingly tasty, for instance, like the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the tallest building in the world at over a third of a mile. Or something more subtle, like the quiet monumentality of the John Hancock Building in Boston. Some buildings offer a more complex and stimulating palette. They can act as metaphors, as comments upon themselves. This is the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale University, a very simple volume of well-proportioned white marble panels. It kind of looks like a bunker. And that's appropriate, I suppose, for a building that's a repository of precious things. Its most notable feature, however, is the interior space, which is lit by exterior light filtering through the marble panels, which turn out to be translucent. The seemingly opaque slabs of marble are actually eggshell-thin panels that emit light while still protecting the perishable books inside. There's a sort of abstract relationship between the quality of light coming through the marble on the right and the lighting of the book stacks within the library on the left. This is a comment about how something can be both a closed, protective repository and an open, accessible resource at the same time. Just like the Taj Mahal, there's more to this building than is perceived at first glance. That interior space at Beinecke is a modern take on a very old concept that we can see at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, where the light filtering in through the stained glass windows creates a sacred precinct that is completely separated from the profane space outside. At the Pantheon in Rome, we can see another example of a building that comments upon itself. The Pantheon sits at one end of Piazza della Rotonda. The piazza is an open space, completely accessible to the public. The interior space is a completely different kind of place, although still accessible to the public. Instead of crowded and noisy, it is solemn and quiet. Instead of active and bustling, it is intimate and contemplative. The space is capped by a dome with an oculus at its apex. The oculus emits light to the space, but ironically, it is also open to the sky. So it also emits rain and snow, making the space at once both inside and outside. It is at one with the plaza, yet totally separate from it. And it has served thus as a place of worship for over 1,500 years. Sacred spaces are not only the purview of ancient cathedrals. The most memorable thing about La Tourette Monastery in France is not the building itself. You will notice those scoop-like forms on the roof at the left. They are the same elements that allow light into the beautifully lit chapel inside. The architect of La Tourette was a Frenchman named Le Corbusier. There's another example of his work at Ronchamp Chapel, also in France. This building presents itself as a form reminiscent of a nun's hat upon approach, but you are forced to walk around a wall full of chiseled openings in order to enter the chapel. Upon entry, you are greeted with this view of light streaming through the openings in the very wall you were just forced to walk around, which resolves to this once your eyes get used to the darkened interior. The architect has provided a lesson for how to create a sacred precinct. He made a place behind a wall that gathers its light by means of penetrations of the wall. It's a treatise on the idea of how you make a special place. As you can see, the experience of architecture, actually traveling to be there, provides a much richer understanding of it. In addition to buildings, I think most architects are probably suckers for a good bridge. And this bridge in particular, because it's the Golden Gate. Now, the Golden Gate Bridge is a symbol of San Francisco, of course, but it also stands as an important gateway in two respects. It's the main link between San Francisco and the Napa Valley region to the north, and it's also a gateway into San Francisco Harbor from the Pacific Ocean. I want to use it as a specific example of how travel can expand an idea very much like the color blue I referred to earlier, but in a much more concrete way. It's called the Golden Gate Bridge, but it's widely recognized as a gateway into San Francisco Harbor and Northern California. Let's consider the difference in meaning between those two apparently synonymous terms. A gate is the actual swinging piece that controls access through an opening. A gateway is something that contains a gate, or as we shall see, could contain a gate. Now, we don't have to travel very far from home to see the most basic kind of gate. This one happens to be on my rear deck. It doesn't hold much symbolism, but it does conform pretty well to the technical definition of a gate. This gate is in Juneau, Alaska. You don't have to go that far to find a gate that closes off a space, but I think it's a good example of a conceptual step up from the gate on my deck, because it contributes to a sense of visual enclosure or visual exclusion from the outside that the gate on my rear deck doesn't have. There's no clue to what's beyond this barrier gate in Abu Dhabi. In fact, the owner of this villa thought that the idea of a barrier gate was so important that he created a fake gate beside the real one for emphasis. This is also a crude example of a symbolic gate, in addition to a functional one. The typical oriental gate, like this one in Japan, is also a true gate. It incorporates a roof, which is a familiar element in the Far East, and it introduces for us the idea of a gateway, an opening that can be closed by a gate. Sattergate is one of many entrances to the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. It's a commemoration to an early supporter of the college, and it's purely symbolic because, as you can see, it cannot be closed. It has no gates. Technically, Sattergate is a gateway, but its symbolic value is such that students have their picture taken beside it at graduation. While there may be no gates in Sattergate, it still stands as a marker to an entry into the Berkeley campus, and everyone recognizes it as a gate nonetheless. At a completely different scale, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris is also a kind of gate. It has no swinging leaves, it leads nowhere, and no one actually goes through it to get anywhere. But it is the most enduring monument in France and the symbolic gateway to its city. Indian Gate at Connaught Circle in New Delhi is another example of a monumental gate that isn't really a gate, but is recognized as such. And finally, we have an abstract monumental gateway, the St. Louis Gateway Arch. It's purely a symbol, though quite a powerful one, that we still recognize as kind of a gate, even though you don't ever go through it. So, I posit that there is this Platonic concept, an idea, really, let's call it gateness, that's present in all these examples. The more we travel, and the more kinds of gates and gateways that we experience, the bigger the concept gets, and the ideas of gate and gateway gradually merge. Just like the color blue, the original concept stretches for more interpretations, and we increase our understanding of the word and the world. Finally, the architect's love of built form does not preclude us from appreciating the sublime beauty of natural landscapes, like sunrise at Dibia Beach in Abu Dhabi, or the early morning mist in the Inside Passage in Alaska, or Mount Baker in the state of Washington at sunset. Places like this at Wafta Lake and Banff National Park in Western Canada are really just idealized gardens. They all have their own order about them, and in that order, we find beauty. I believe that architecture, the making of meaningful places, is just a way to reorder the natural environment for our own use. Consider this woodcut by Charles Dominique Eisen, which was the frontispiece for a book called Essays sur Architecture by Marc-Antoine Lagier, published in 1755. The woman, symbolizing architecture, is directing the cherub, symbolizing man, toward a primitive hut. The hut was constructed, if you can call it that, of sticks and branches arranged among some trees in the woods. It was Logier's way of illustrating that architecture is just nature reordered. Just a humble intervention, no more than, say, a pile of rocks in a trail car. But it brings a sense of order to the environment, and in that order, there is a kind of beauty. Not unlike this terraced rice paddy in Bali. In Hong Kong, like in New York City, the man-made completely overwhelms the natural environment. Because not all buildings are beautiful. Certainly the most compelling thing about this concrete plant in Jebel Ali, Abu Dhabi, is the group of flamingos in front of it. Nor is all building architecture. This concrete plant along the Bow River north of Calgary could be considered by some an industrial eyesore. Often, the structures we create, like the Hoover Dam on Lake Mead, completely disrupt the natural order. But despite that disruption, we can complement nature at the same time. At this steel plant along the Lehigh River in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, there is a certain appeal to the idea of an artificial structure residing in the landscape. Because the man-made has a sort of beauty of its own. It was at this abandoned Bethlehem steel plant that I was able to capture one of the more provocative images I've ever seen. This is the welfare room at Bethlehem Steel. Those copper cups are receptacles for the valuables the workers at the plant carried with them to work. The valuables were placed into cups, and the cups were hoisted by those chains up to the ceiling and locked in place by individual keys that fit into that radiator-like apparatus in the background. They were thus held safely until the end of the workers' shifts, when they unlocked the chains, retrieved their possessions, and went home. I realized that this was an early industrialized idea of a locker room. I think it's possible for the man-made and the natural to coexist in a kind of uneasy choreography, grating yet somehow in harmony, like the grain of sand creating the pearl in the oyster. You are faced with two opposing ideas, and you must reconcile them. The natural and the man-made can be made harmonious, like these examples from Hocking Hills State Park in Ohio. When you find a built environment in total harmony with the natural environment around it, like at Falling Water in Pennsylvania, it is somehow very satisfying. Because isn't that the way things ought to be, with the machine residing peacefully in the garden? Their entwinement forcing us to confront an uneasy moment and forge a new idea about just what beauty can be. Whatever your preference about travel, I urge you to get away. Face the unknown and expand on your ideas about things. It's worth the trouble. Remember, Paul Astor asked, "Why write?" It was because he had something to say. I asked, "Why travel?" It's because you might have something to learn. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Good, I explained everything.
I have a question. In your description of what you're going to present, something caught my attention, and I want you refer to cookie cutter hotels. My experience traveling in Europe has been anything but cookie cutter hotels. They've been small, family runs. I just wondered how did you find that?
Well, as I've designed hotels for 20 years, and pretty soon you find out that no matter what the size or style of a hotel room is, it's always the same thing. You always go in the door, past the bathroom to the place where the bed is, and there's a window on the outside wall, usually with an HVAC machine underneath it. And so I appreciate that as you go around the world, hotels are different. I do appreciate that. Some of the most wonderful hotels I've ever stayed in are in Europe. But there is a formula to a hotel room. And when you've seen enough of them, the first thing you realize is a formula. And it's difficult to get away from that once you see it. It's sort of like, I can't unsee that. Anybody else? Steve?
Yes, you introduced a lot of philosophy here, and it's very interesting to see how you can relate to different things and see beyond what you're looking at. It's very nice to think about.
Well, that's the idea, to get you to think, right? That's what travel can do. It can get you to think. And, things take on a new form. And as you travel, you expand your horizon. I really think that's what it's about. Anybody else? Go
I
ahead.
wanted to ask you your opinion of this, like a building like the Stadium building in MIT.
The which building?
The Stadium building. The one that, I forgot the architect and everything. It's almost like the glass is down.
Oh, is that the one on Mass Ave?
Yes.
I
can't remember the one.
Cheryl, you want to comment on this? As I as I aged as an architect, I started to appreciate, what really happened was, and there's a point to this, so bear with me. I worked for an architect in Cleveland a long time ago, and he always had very strict budgets for his buildings. I mean, he argued with the client about whether he was going to put 2 coats of paint on a concrete block wall or 3. It was that kind of, budget. And so he was a small, I think he had an actual reputation. His name was Don Isaka. But he was basically a good local architect, and it was one of the first jobs I had out of architecture school. And I worked for him for a few years. I worked on a few projects at school. I worked on a Jewish temple in Cleveland Heights. And I thought these buildings were great. I really was enamored of them. But I went back 20 years later, and I realized that they didn't hold up so well. They were made of concrete block, and the concrete block started to bleed. And the schools got beat up, they got graffiti on them, and they didn't look so good anymore. So the architecture didn't last. And as I went to work, Kathy mentioned that Cheryl and I worked at Stubbins Associates. Stubbins had a lot bigger budgets. And, we didn't argue about how many coats of paint on the wall. We argued about whether it was going to be marble or limestone on the walls. And we built embassies and buildings all around the world. And as those buildings aged, they got old too, and some of them didn't look so good, but some of them lasted. Like that chapel that I showed you, Ronchamp Chapel, that was built back in the 50s and 60s. So it's 60 or 70 years old now, and it still looks like the day, at least when I visited, it still looked like the day it was built. I don't think that the building you're referring to in 40 years, if it's still there, is going to age well. I think a lot of architects just try to do things differently and don't think of their buildings as being part of a kind of a living organism that have to last for the time that they are where they are. And I think that building is a good example of a building that will not last. Anybody else? Yes.
Have you ever seen the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City, Utah?
Yes, sir.
Would you say that's a building that will last a long time, built based upon its architecture?
Yes, I think it will. And actually, there are a number of Mormon temples around the United States that are beautiful buildings. I mean, they're really beautiful buildings. And I think that, they are meant to express the Mormon experience, which is great. But yeah, I think the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City is a beautiful building, and I think it'll last 50 or 100 years, and it'll probably still look just as good when it, then as it does now, or it did, or when it was built. Yep.
Jim, having seen the triangular glass structure just outside the Louvre in Paris, is that something that you would consider so unique and so different that it's just misplaced? That it doesn't fit the architect of everything else that's consistent with the Louvre?
Well, the irony of that is that was done by an architect named Diane Beyer.
Right.
And the ironic thing about it is that Pei was actually hired to make, the Louvre is a huge building. If you've been there, you know. It's huge, it's 3 or 4 stories, and it just goes on forever and ever and ever. And Pei was originally hired to do a wayfinding concept for the museum. And he thought that the Louvre needed a new image. Well, you can't reclad it. You can't paint it. So his answer was that pyramid, which is actually the entrance to the Louvre now, and goes into a bunch of subterranean tunnels that branch out to the various parts of the Louvre. That's an interesting question, whether it fits. I personally think it does. But I think it fits in the same way that that an orange would fit in a pile of apples. It fits because it's different enough that it can stand on its own. And I think it gives a new meaning to that plaza, because the plaza was unused before, except as a sort of light emitting element. And now it's the main entry to the Louvre. So I think in many ways it's very successful. My opinion. Yes, sir.
Hi. Are you familiar with the Fairhaven High School on the way to New Bedford? It has a pretty elaborate architecture for a high school.
Yes, I know.
I think a big oil magnet. It had a lot of money to spend, so they made this elaborate high. And then there's some additions to it, which are kind of a modern variation. And I'm just wondering about your comment. Is it good, bad, or neutral, or what?
I haven't gone through it. I've only driven past it. It doesn't look to me like a high school. It looks more like a monumental civic building. And I can't help but when I think of high schools, I think back to those 2 or 3 coats of paint on a concrete block wall. I don't think Fairhaven High School is going to be there in 30 years. I think that building will be destroyed at the end of its lifespan. And I never thought that when I was young, I never thought about living long enough to see buildings outlive their lifespan. And you know, the buildings that I referred to by the architect in Cleveland, I mean, some of those buildings ought to be torn down. They've reached their effective life. But I mentioned Stubbs before. We built an embassy, and when we built this is the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. And when we built it, we talked about using materials that would last 50 or 100 years. You know, making sure that it was stone and concrete with, you know, galvanized reinforcing or epoxy-coated reinforcing that would last 100 years. And actually, if you read Albert Speer's book about the Nazi Reich, they built their buildings to last hundreds of years. I don't think Fairhaven High School is going to do that.
I'm surprised with that.
Kathy?
Yeah, how about Frank Geary's building, the convention center? You can find an egg on it.
She's talking about the Walt Disney.
Frank Geary's an interesting architect, because if you look at some of his the buildings he did when he was very young, they were just very plain buildings. And I went to a lecture with him that he gave once, and it was when he had first started building these weird buildings. I don't know of all of you know about Frank Geary, but he builds these very strange buildings. And he showed a slide in his lecture, and it had a long, narrow thing over here, and a cube here, and a smaller rectangle over here, and a kind of pointed thing over here. And he said, "This is a house." He said, "That's the roof, and this is the living room, and that's the bedroom." And then somebody said, "What's that long thing?" And he said, "Well, that's the hall." And his point was that he was trying to explode architecture into its component pieces. And if you've seen his buildings, you know that that's what he's done now. And then he explodes the building program, and then he covers it with these very sophisticated skins of platinum and, you know, aluminum and gold-plated steel and all the kinds of things he uses. And he really is involved in a search for original form, for form that nobody's ever seen before. If you walk through the student union over at MIT, which he designed, you can see that it hasn't borne its years well. It's a beautiful building, but it's wearing out, frankly, and his buildings leak. So,
Like Frank Lloyd Wright.
you know, Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings leak too. That's true. But Frank Lloyd Wright built falling water, and people care enough about falling water that 100 years later, it still looks beautiful. Yeah, there are cracks in the concrete. Yeah, it leaks, but people care enough about that building to invest money to keep it looking like when it was new. And I think that's a testament to architecture. People care enough about it to keep it up. I think that means they like it and they're comfortable with it. Like this building, I mean, I think this building is, for what it is, it's a great example of a one-room schoolhouse. Here it is, and people care about it, and people keep it up, and we use it today for the same kind of thing it was used, back when it was a schoolhouse. So I think that, architecture, sort of like a dog, has a way of keeping itself in the mix. If you like it well enough, you'll keep it around, right?
Well, Stanford White's building still exists, so it's like, some of the old buildings in New York City, they've been there for a while.
And they were built, they're built out of limestone and marble and other materials that'll last a long time. They were built to last, and people love them. And I mean, going to New York Public Library is beautiful. I don't really like to get involved in making judgments about style, but we've talked about 3 or 4 very different styles of architecture right there, and it really doesn't matter what style the architecture is. If people love it, they'll make sure it stays around. Yes?
By any chance have you been to Antarctica?
Darn, you say that. It's the one continent I have not been to. You can ask Cheryl. I've been.
Well, the reason I say that is my husband, who was at the oceanographer for many years, went down, and he was at risk because it was a hand-picked crew. He still had his appendix. And if you remember reading about the woman who had the surgery,
Yes.
so he was basically at risk, but it was a hand-picked crew, and they wanted him to go, but he was at risk because he still had his appendix. So it's kind of a funny family story.
If I had been to Antarctica, you would have seen some pictures of it. I want to go there. I've been looking for an excuse to go there. It's kind of a lifelong thing, and it's the only continent I haven't set foot on.
It's your bucket list.
My bucket list, yeah, definitely my bucket list. Anybody else? Yeah,
Have you been to St. Peter's Cathedral in Moscow?
I've seen it. I've never been. I've driven past it. I've never been into it.
I actually have that.
I've been there.
That was designed to, when was that built?
Pardon me?
When was that built? I mean, it looks like it could last a long time.
Oh yeah, it was definitely built for the ages. No question about it. That's a symbol of the Russian Empire. What are you talking about? That's that's like the Colosseum in Rome.
Okay.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much, everybody, for
Thank
coming.
you.